This week on Quadriga, lessons from Boston, living with terror. The bombs that went off at the Boston Marathon were the first major attack on American soil since 9/11. The search for the attackers progressed rapidly. Two brothers who were suspected of the crime were identified and tracked down within just a few days. Although security offices are directing more and more resources at preventing terrorist attacks, it will never be possible to stop the violence completely. In other parts of the world, the last decades have seen some of the most deadly terrorist activity in history. How can democracies protect themselves? How much freedom are we willing to sacrifice for the promise of more security? Your host today, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. What lessons can be drawn from the Boston bombings, if any? Is there such a thing, such as total security? That's what I want to talk about on today's show, together with the three experts. Welcome to Nicholas Kulish, who has been the Berlin Correspondent for the New York Times since 2007. Tom Goeller is a German journalist and a security affairs expert who in the past has written for the Washington Times and Egypt Today. And Lüders is a German writer and journalist who has covered the Middle East for many years. Thank you all for being here. Nicholas Kulish, since 9/11 and the inception of the Department of Homeland Security, the United States government have spent a lot of money on trying to secure that such an attack on U.S. soil could not happen again. Yet here we are again. What do you make of this?
Well, I think the lesson is that you just can't stop everything. And, as much as you can focus in on Al-Qaeda, if there's two brothers with pressure cookers, you're never going to be able to get everything there. I mean, terrorism existed before 9/11. Obviously, Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City killed many more people than the Tsarnaev brothers. And you just have to ask yourself, total security is either a myth or something that would require the loss of all of our freedoms.
Tom Goeller, total security is a myth, says Nicholas Kulish. Would you agree?
Of course, in general, yes. However, of course, we need to try to come close to that. And I found it very impressive when President Bush, after 9/11, immediately said, I do everything I can to prevent any other attack. And he actually did. That's not that I'm blaming President Obama now, that he failed to secure the American people. However, obviously, President Bush had an agenda, had a plan, and it worked. So I would recommend to look into his government and to find out why it worked there and why it didn't now.
Lüders, does the Boston bombing show that all the emphasis and focus on Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups are basically futile if two brothers, as Nicholas Kulish put it, if two brothers decide that they, in their own name, want to commit such an act?
Absolutely, yeah. There is no total security available. It's simply not possible to really make sure that no terrorist attacks of this type happen. Al-Qaeda is more or less a threat of the past. Al-Qaeda has been weakened. This organization is still in operation, so to speak, but I think the danger for the future ahead, not only for the United States, but for other countries as well, is really radicalized individuals who, for whatever reason, believe that they need to make a message very clear, and they kill innocent people. And this is what happened in Boston. And I think soul-searching in the United States will be a little bit difficult. It doesn't fit into the normal scheme, this attack in Boston. Yes, they are Islamists to a certain extent. They are Muslim culprits, but they are not really part of any Islamist network, at least according to our knowledge at this stage. So we're talking about radicalized individuals, and this is a big threat, not only from the Islamist side, but also from the right-wing extremist side, so to speak. Let's think about Anders Breivik in Norway, who 2 years ago killed so many Norwegians, and nobody, no security apparatus would have been able to prevent this. Once you have an individual who is smart enough not to, get involved into too much internet gossip, it's almost impossible to track these people down, and we have to get used to these threats.
We have to get used to them, says Lüders. But Nicholas Kulish, a lot of people in the immediate aftermath of the Boston bombings were proclaiming that terrorism is back in the United States. Do you think that was a bit overdrawn, the reaction?
Well, I mean, I think we had also had shootings at Fort Hood, I think it was, where military personnel flipped out and killed many of his colleagues there. And again, I mean, you look. In some ways, this is almost like a hybrid. I mean, you have the two disaffected young people that could just as easily be Columbine, Colorado, or could just as easily, be the attacks that we saw in Connecticut recently. But then influenced by Al-Qaeda English language propaganda on the internet and learning bomb making instructions. And so I guess in that sense, I just mean that there are lots of different kinds of violent activities taking place all the time. And can you necessarily limit that and think of it as being part of this international terrorism picture?
To my opinion, this is a bit easily being said that this attack could not have been prevented. With the knowledge we have today, we know that the elder brother of the two attackers was under the surveillance of the FBI. So we know it is an intelligence failure that this could have happened. And to say that this particular attack could not have been prevented is, I think, too easily said. This is what the Obama administration, of course, likes to send out as a message. In general, I agree that in general we cannot prevent terrorist attacks. This is simply impossible. But Islamist attacks on the United States, I think, yes, we can prevent.
And indeed, Tom Goeller is picking up on an important point. A lot of people are talking about the failings of the FBI here, because it seems that Russia had indeed warned the U.S. about these individuals up front. What do you make of these security intelligence failures, Lüders?
Well, any security apparatus is always made up of individuals, of human beings, and these people, they make mistakes. I mean, the same was the case prior to 9/11. Possibly it would have been, feasible to avoid this attack had the, security apparatus been more efficient at that time. But this is really discussing, about spoiled milk. I mean, yes, in theory it might have been possible, but in practice there are so many people out there, weirdos, who are willing to kill other people. I think we need to be realistic. Yes, there needs to be, more work needs to be done, and especially we have to be careful not to be ideologically blind on the right eye. I mean, Islamist terror is one thing, is one big issue, and another big issue, of course, is what are the right-wing extremists doing? This is also a problem for the United States.
And there's one thing to be said, what could have been done right before the attacks. There's another thing talking about the reactions in the immediate aftermath of the bombings. Look at what several Republican congressmen said. They said, let's treat Josar Tsarnaev, one of the perpetrators, as an enemy combatant, which would have given him the same status as those in prison in Guantanamo. What goes through your mind when you hear these things, Nicholas Kulish?
That the same easy answers and the same things that have put us in some ways in this position are not gonna help. I mean, we have a justice system that I think is one of the best in the world, and in a case where people commit a crime on an American soil, we can try them on American soil. We don't have to go dumping them into semi-legal prisons in Cuba and so on. And I think this gets to a larger debate. With one side saying, we do whatever it takes to stop any hint of an incident, and another side that says, when you have Guantanamo, when you have indiscriminate drone strikes in other countries, you basically create the impression among people that you're an unlawful power. And I think that for a lot of young, angry people, America is becoming that in their eyes.
And Tom Goeller, indeed, let's talk about the proposals to try this young man as an enemy combatant, at least the suggestion. George W. Bush, in the aftermath of 9/11, said, you are not going to destroy our way of life, our values. Right. But would you say that these proposals are already undermining the U.S. way of life, the U.S. sense of fairness and judicial system? Well,
yes, in a certain way, because the freedom that America stands for, or this spirit of freedom and liberty, has vanished a bit. And we all were so happy that the whole society, the whole U.S. society, recovered in the past 10 to 12 years after 9/11. And now again we have this other homeland attack, so to speak. And I agree to a certain extent with Republicans who say we should treat them as enemy combatants, not necessarily, as you said, to dump them at Jitmo, but to treat them as enemy combatants because that's what they are. They are not just lunatics. They are not just some people who want to throw a bomb. They have a mission. They have a goal, a political goal, and it is to destroy the Western society, the Western freedom. I also see...
But they're also naturalized citizens of the United States.
Well, yes, but we all know where they come from, and sometimes some just use this to... You know, they are Americans by passport, but not by spirit.
So you would be in favor of trying Tsarnaev as an enemy combatant?
Yes, I would.
And if we look at, because we've been talking about Guantanamo indeed, and if we look at the current events that are taking place right now in Guantanamo, 84 prisoners are currently on hunger strike because they're protesting against their indefinite detention, and most of them are saying that they don't even know why they're being held. Point being, do you think that these kind of news and the fact to propose this young man as an enemy combatant only breeds more terror rather than less?
Well, difficult to say, but basically speaking, I would say a criminal is a criminal, and nothing more than that. So I personally don't think it's helpful to talk about enemy combatants, because what does this mean? Enemy combatant means you send someone to a foreign territory, to Cuba in that case, to Jitmo, and there this person, this enemy combatant, will remain under sometimes very dubious reasons. There are dozens of people who are at Jitmo for one single reason. No country is willing to accept them when they come home. So this is, in my view, really an expression of a moral and legal bankruptcy of the American legal system. President Obama is very much aware of this, but he is not able to really to persuade the more conservative part of the American political system to accept the idea to either put these people on trial or to let them go. So in order to create new enemy combatants is not really, solving the issue. And what do you do? If you really think this thought to the very end, what do you do with right-wing American terrorists who, go out for shooting accidents in some schools in the United States? What do you do with them? Do you also declare them to be enemy combatants and send them to Jitmo? I think this is not really a solution. I think they need a fair and legal trial with all consequences, of course.
If this would be the case, as you said, bankruptcy of the American legal system and so forth, President Obama would have dissolved Jitmo. That is what he promised before he became president. But he learned his lesson. He understood why Jitmo is necessary. And this is why we still have it. So I think it is in this way important to treat them as enemy combatants, because it also sends a signal to those who attack the United States that they are understood as enemies. We are on war with you, and if you declare war on us, then you have to face all the consequences, and not those typical European consequences that in the end you as the perpetrator, in the end you are declared a victim, as we had by the European Commission a couple of times.
Well, I think that's a very distinct explanation of things. First of all, I think it's not because Mr. Obama learned his lesson that Jitmo still exists. It was simply that he could not overcome the pressures, mainly of the right wing in the United States, of the Republicans, in order to close Jitmo. It's a very delicate political issue in the United States for unfortunate matters. And I think we should really stick and adhere to the legal system. If you think the Bush administration's dealing with these enemy combatants to the end, we are talking about Afghanistan, we are talking about Iraq, the results not being very satisfactory for American policymaking, not to mention the suffering of the people in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I am a strong adherent of a legal thinking. And as I mentioned before, what do you do with right-wing combatants, which the United States have also seen? What do you do with the Timothy Vey? Do you send them to Jitmo because you declare them enemy combatants? I think this doesn't really solve the issue. And unfortunately, we have to learn to live with this type of terror. I'm very much afraid that in the future we will see even more attacks of radicalized individuals, and it's more difficult to track them down. I mean, psychologically speaking, I think for any country being attacked, like the United States have experienced it now in Boston, it's easier, so to speak, psychologically speaking, to have an enemy who comes from abroad, to say, well, they are Chechens, they are Pakistanis, they are Palestinians, whatever. It's more difficult to admit, well, we also have a homegrown terrorism. This time it was really Islamist terrorists, no doubt about that. But next time maybe we have some right-winger who thinks he should blow up the United Nations building.
To bring this right-wing thing up, we are talking about this Islamist attack. It is one, it was one, and it has to be treated differently from right-wing attacks of genuine Americans.
That's your point of view.
That's my point. Be treated differently. Also, there's only one category of American. It's American. There's no special category for Muslims. It's if you're an American citizen, you're an American citizen. Yes. It's genuine. But I just think, I mean, at this point, what you do is you chip away at your values slowly but surely until you ask yourself, what do we have and what do we stand for? I mean, first it's okay to take people and to illegally render them to be tortured. It's okay to kidnap people and to put them in places like Poland and Romania and to do things to them. Then it's okay to shoot very specific targets, with drone missiles. Then we're killing American citizens with drone missiles. And at a certain point, if you found yourself in an argument, as I have in places like Egypt, with somebody about what America is or what America's values are, it becomes a lot more difficult to defend. And that, I think, actually opens us up to not just criticism, but to increased radicalization abroad and at home.
Absolutely.
And indeed, it is part of a much broader debate, which Nicholas Kulish has brought up, namely, how much freedom are we willing to sacrifice for promises of more security? How much more would you like civil rights to be limited in order to at least create the illusion of security, Tom Goeller?
Not at all. No, I don't want to sacrifice any liberty. I agree with both of you that we have to live with the situation, but we can still do a lot to prevent certain attacks, and this also, every single one of us has to look into our societies and see where threats are coming from, and do way more and invest way more into prevention of that kind of attacks, so that we don't have to give up the liberties we all cherished so much. And this is what the Western civilization stands for. And
there are some people who are saying that rather than fighting and combating terrorism, we should look at the symptoms. We should fight the symptoms of terrorism rather. Would you agree, and what are those symptoms?
Yeah, very good question, very justified question. I mean, in the case of these two Chechen brothers, I'm not really very sure about their motivation. I mean, if we look at it from an Islamist point of view, it doesn't really make sense from a Chechen point of view to attack the United States. It makes absolutely no sense because the Chechens are a minority within Russia, and they have been prosecuted by the Russian regime in the past. There have been very many terrorist attacks in Russia perpetrated by Chechens, but as I mentioned, there is no whatever, combination of anger or wrath against the United States by Chechens. So we are talking obviously about two individuals who, for whatever reason, failed in their integration. They disliked the American idea of freedom, etc., etc. Very difficult to speculate on that. But that's only one aspect of terrorism. The United States are also facing criticism and terror because, American policies in the past, I don't want to generalize, but, American policies have created havoc in many parts of the world, in Iraq and Afghanistan, Vietnam, etc., etc. The Americans have learned their lessons, but still there are so many radicalized individuals who have good reasons, from their point of view, to get, aggressive. Let's just think about these drone attacks against innocent civilians in Pakistan, Yemen, and other parts of the world. Of course, you radicalize whole tribes, whole regions in Pakistan, in Yemen, and elsewhere, and these people will try to take revenge. And this is, that's the price you pay as a superpower. I mean, any country is committing mistakes. Maybe the United States have committed too many mistakes in the past 10, 15 years. But the Americans, especially the administration of Obama, they have learned the lessons to a certain extent. They are, refraining from, direct involvement in the civil war in Syria or in Mali and West Africa, as opposed to the Europeans, the Germans, the French, who appear to be repeating American mistakes of the past now.
Nicholas Kulish, would you agree that the attacks on U.S. soil are the reaction or the backlash of a U.S. foreign policy perhaps gone wrong?
I mean, I think you find when you look at radicalized individuals that they're often looking at the same kinds of videos, and that or that there's a step-by-step process where you begin by looking at videos of victims of dead people that's blamed on the United States, and eventually you get your way to the bomb-making video. And I think that if you look 10 years ago at the beginning of the Iraq invasion, you would have people in Baghdad, women going shopping in the markets while we were shooting missiles at the Iraqi capital, because they believed that we had smart bombs and that we would target the defense ministry, we would target the oil ministry, but we wouldn't hit the bazaar, so to speak. And now I think the impression kind of is that bombs just drop from above. If an informant gives a bad bit of information to the CIA, then you're out of luck in Peshawar. And I think that when those attitudes change about the United States, it makes it harder for us to defend ourselves on a moral level.
I think here comes up also a or a completely other aspect, and that is only if you attack the United States, you gain publicity. And the Chechen war has almost been forgotten. The Europeans who always blame the US for the Chitmo inhabitants never cared a bit about how many died in Chechnya. They never accused really Putin and all the others what they did there. This really dirty war of the Russians didn't interest the Europeans. The Europeans always blame the Americans because they gain reputation with that. It's easy to bash the Americans. It's hard to bash the Russians. Coming back to those two Chechens, it's not a far-fetched speculation. The Chechen war goes calmly on, but nobody realizes it, and the Europeans are not interested in it. So what can you do? You do any kind of attack, and you gain towards the United States, and you gain an immediate publicity. So this is my speculation about why they did that. Of course, I don't know either the real reason, but it makes a certain sense.
Well, one of the perpetrators, the older one who got killed, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, seemed to be guided and motivated by what he perceived to be an assault on Islam. Very much the same theme that Nicholas Kulish was talking about, the one that appears in these videos that motivates these young people to go and commit such atrocities. Would you agree with the premise that there's such an attack on part of the Western world on Islam?
Well, the relations between the Western world and Islam are, of course, very complicated. But in the past, especially since 9/11, I think very many young Muslims have become radicalized for various reasons. Of course, some of these radicalized Muslims do play the blame game, the United States being responsible for any evil upon earth. But nevertheless, there have been, failed policies in the past. And of course, from a Muslim point of view, even if you're a moderate Muslim, you see military action in Afghanistan, you see it in Iraq, you see it in Libya. You don't see it in Syria.
The Americans were not in Libya.
The Americans were not in Libya, but they were pulling the strings a little bit in the back. I don't want to criticize the military engagement in Libya. It's a different topic. But I was very much in favor of toppling this regime. But as I mentioned, from a moderate Muslim point of view, you get the impression, being a Muslim means that you are a potential target. And I think even when you talk about the moderate streams of Muslim societies, there is a certain wrath or a certain non-understanding of Western policies.
But these young men, I'm sorry to interrupt, but these young men must know that with these acts, these terrorist attacks, they are only deteriorating the image of Islam worldwide. Isn't that the case?
Absolutely, but I think that when we talk about these radicalized individuals, they do not think that far. They have their own personal agenda. As you mentioned before, they're radicalized through videos or through a certain ideology or maybe through their parents, you never know. But in this particular case, when we talk about Boston, it's still a little bit weird because there's a very small number of Chechens only living in the United States. There are many more living in European countries, including Germany. So if you are a radicalized Chechen, it makes more sense to make an attack in Paris and Berlin and Madrid, London, in order to persuade the Europeans to do something for the Chechen cause, if you want to look at it that way. But doing this harm in the United States only means that Putin now has a pretext to even, continue his suppression of the Chechens, because he says, well, we're all in one boat, the United States and us, we are fighting the same enemy.
And indeed, you have already mentioned some of the cities that have also been hit by international terrorism. Boston and the United States, of course, not the only city, or rather country that has been hit by international terrorism in the past decade. Let's have a quick look.
In 2002, less than a year after the September 11th attacks in the U.S., there was carnage on the island of Bali when suicide bombers blew themselves up at a tourist nightclub. Over 200 people were killed. In 2004, just 3 days before national elections in Spain, coordinated explosions in the train system in the capital, Madrid, killed 191 people and wounded nearly 2,000 more. Later in 2004, a group of armed separatist militants from Chechnya and Ingushetia seized control of a school in the Russian city of Beslan. By the time a 3-day siege ended, at least 300 people were dead, many of them children. In 2008, a series of bombings and shootings rocked the Indian megacity Mumbai. Over a period of 3 days, the members of a Pakistan-based militant organization killed over 150 people and wounded hundreds more. Iraq and Afghanistan have suffered more than any other countries from terrorist attacks. In the last 10 years, they have claimed tens of thousands of lives in those countries. Between 2002 and 2011, attacks there accounted for around a third of all terrorist-related casualties worldwide.
Well, Nicholas Kulish, we have just seen a variety of unfortunate scenes and attacks in the past. Now let's look. Some people are saying there's a double standard perhaps here involved. 3 people have died in Boston. That's 3 too many. But in hindsight and in place in context, these kind of attacks are almost a weekly occurrence in Islamabad, in Kabul, and in Baghdad. You've covered Baghdad, and most of the times the number of casualties is much higher than what we are seeing in the Boston bombings. Do you think there's a double standard that some people are saying American casualties count more, if you will, than casualties someplace else?
I mean, I think there is an element of that, for sure. But I think that also in this instance, the high-profile nature of the event, I mean, people sit and watch the Boston Marathon on television even without the expectation of violence or something happening. And the contrast between the sort of the celebration and the holiday and the runners and then the death and the destruction. I think destruction is key. Just as in the embassy bombings in Africa, it was often overlooked that hundreds of people were blinded. These bombs did not kill very many people because they were put low on the ground, but scores of people lost limbs or lost function. But I mean, I think more broadly, does one Pakistani death get as much attention as one American death? Absolutely not. But the event was chosen specifically for a maximum media impact, you could say.
Indeed, the media coverage about Boston has gotten a lot of play worldwide, whereas the attacks, for instance, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or perhaps Iraq, are often rather just a small footnote in the so-called Western media. How do you explain this?
Well, of course, as you said, the Boston Marathon is world famous, and as far as I know, even 227 Germans were registered to run. So it is more than just an American event. It is a world event for world peace, kind of, or it stands.
One of the victims was Chinese. One of the 3 killed.
Right. It stands for what the West actually stands for. So it is definitely an attack on Western values, and that is come together, live multicultural, let's overcome religion and where you come from. And the Boston Marathon stands for much more than just a sportive event. Of course, if I think about when a gunman would run amok in East LA, say, would they close down Brentwood and Santa Monica as they did in Boston? Sure, they wouldn't, even if there would be way more victims. It has a different symbolic meaning, or it had a different symbolic meaning in Boston.
Some have called the reaction in the immediate aftermath of the bombings, not just on the part of the media, but in general, as disproportionate. Would you agree?
Well, I mean, from a security point of view, it is, of course, very difficult to judge what officials will decide or not. Of course, as an official, you are interested in not, seeing more people killed. So it's difficult to judge from a German, from Berlin, as whether or not, the security apparatus was functioning well in Boston. Of course, it was, quite a big thing to shut down the city. But nevertheless, in such a situation, you have to act preventively. You have to try the best you can in order to avoid further deaths. But it was still, in my view, very interesting to see that this hunting down of these two terrorists really became a witch hunt to a certain extent. I mean, it was a huge, how shall I call it, undertaking, so many people participating. In this case, things went out fine, but what had, the wrong culprits been looked upon? When you have the media, when you have the social media, pointing out to a certain person, like saying, Mr. Aslan, he is supposed to be behind these attacks.
Well, let's hope not.
Let's hope, but I don't want to be Mr. Aslan in such a case, because when you have a whole city, chasing you, it's very difficult to explain, well, this is a misunderstanding. So I'm a little bit skeptical about this type of witch hunt, let's say, and it's quite ironic. In the end, it was, a private citizen who really gave the decisive information as to where this one surviving culprit
And indeed, Nicholas Kulish, Michael Lüders raises an important point. The New York Post, for instance, right after the bombings, depicted two young men on their cover, basically suggesting that these might be the perpetrators. If we look at the media coverage in general, and we're all journalists here how would you assess, how would you rate the media coverage that has accompanied the Boston bombings?
Well, I think, you had CNN getting out ahead of itself a little bit as well. I mean, I think that something has changed in the metabolism or the speed at which the media is supposed to work. I think Twitter has contributed a great deal to that, where every single person wants to be the first in every instance. And in a story like this, where having covered the sniper case in Washington D.C., for instance, or the aftermath of 9/11, in the old days you had a couple of hours to sort through things, to take a lead, to call somebody, to check it, to double check it. Somebody could even make a mistake on the law enforcement side and get back to you before anything ended up in print. Whereas now, it goes basically straight from a text message in your cell phone onto the air at CNN, or straight from a photo sharing website into a witch hunt. And so I think that news organizations are going to have to learn to be a little more responsible, and hopefully some way will be found to keep social media in check as well.
But I think it's not only the news media who are to blame, but also the recipients, or those who use Twitter and Facebook. They have also a certain responsibility. Since I'm familiar with the Middle East as well, I can see the huge difference how the young Egyptians used the social media in comparison to now. For them, for the Egyptians, they started a revolution. It was either we get Mubarak down or we fail, right? So it had a very serious basis to use Twitter and Facebook 2 years ago on the Tahrir place. In comparison to what we experienced in Boston, some were simply posting photoshopped pictures, and they had a kind of excitement and fun doing this, not understanding how serious this issue is. So I really would blame those people, whether they are young or old, doesn't matter, who acted completely irresponsible by using the social media that way. And I can really see the huge difference is for the Egyptians, there was a lot at stake. And in this case in Boston, obviously not.
And Michael Lüders, do you think there's become the sentiment, if you will, that it's more important to be quick rather than accurate?
Yes, absolutely. I think so. And I think, we should not underestimate the psychological impact of such a terrorist attack happening in Boston. I think many people in the United States, but also abroad, do, of course, identify immediately with the victims for good reasons. But then, of course, rationality is sometimes a little bit difficult to achieve. There is still another interesting aspect in my view. As we mentioned before, 3 dead people in Boston, 3 too many, no doubt about that. But still, from a psychological point of view, I find it interesting that we identify so much with these 3 unfortunate victims of this terrorist attack. I mean, I think in the past year, some 30,000 people were killed in the United States through the use of guns, in most cases by illegal guns. And yet, people seem to accept that. 30,000 dead people, killed for nothing, because there are quite absurd gun laws in the United States, at least from our European perspective, but nobody seems to care. But then suddenly there's a terrorist attack in Boston, 3 people get killed, and it's a huge uproar. As I mentioned before, from a psychological point of view, it's of course understandable, because when the enemy comes from the outside, or when the enemy is even unknown, it's something that challenges you. That's the type of story Hollywood makes many movies on, and it's interesting to see this psychology working. At the same time, we simply don't care about dead people in Syria, about dead people in Baghdad. This is out of the horizon for us, because it's a different world. We do not identify with people in Syria and Baghdad, but we do identify for good reasons with people and victims in Boston. That's good to a certain extent, but we should not forget the other victims there on earth, be it in Baghdad and Damascus, or be it in the United States even, where so many people are killed through these quite absurd gun laws, in my view.
I remember right after 9/11, or between 9/11 and the founding of the Department of Homeland Security, I was speaking with a Harvard professor of risk analysis, and we were talking about how to make these decisions of how many billions to invest in this and how many hundreds of millions to invest in that. And he said, well, of course we would save more lives if we took 1/100th of that money and just put up signs telling people to wash their hands, because you could prevent 100,000 deaths a year that way. But obviously people care. Or when a space shuttle crashes, that's the same number of people killed as in a car accident. But the world attention is completely different. And so we put certain overemphases, certain irrationalities that come to the fore, and the fear of terror is absolutely one of them. And I think it's then, for that reason, important to step back and ask, are we really prioritizing the right things? And the gun debate is a perfect example of that.
And have Americans, after 9/11, after the installment of the Department of Homeland Security, would you say by and large, up until the Boston bombings, have they felt safer?
I would say that they probably do. I mean, the September 11th event was so singular as to, you don't think, in the way that Israelis perhaps, fear going to a club or going to a grocery store that a bomb might go off, that it's simply not the same thing. I think Americans were more prone to complain about not being allowed to take their shampoo on the airplane than to actually really understand what was going on. But I think more small incidents like this, I think, actually sow greater fear than single spectacular incidents. And the terrifying thing about this was that, if you look at it from a lesson learned standpoint, from the terrorist perspective and from the American perspective, you show small number of people, unsophisticated weapons, can sow maximum fear, maximum media attention, and shut down a city for several days. The incentive structure that you're setting up there for people who want to commit acts like this is an unfortunate one.
What drove me actually mad is that those 2 guys achieved what Hitler and Emperor Hirohito did not achieve. That is to stop the Greyhound. They even stopped the buses to run. And sorry for this. Yeah. But I would also like to look into, when you call the American gun laws absurd, from an American perspective, the German road laws are absurd. You have the same numbers or the death toll is as high here in Germany for speeding, for this absurd, irrational speeding, or that the Germans want to run from A to B on their motorways in an absurd high speed. we cannot identify ourselves with every victim. So from whatever perspective you look at it, I would recommend more to come to how the Israelis live. They live with a daily threat for decades. And they did not give up their freedom, their liberty, their democracy. It has not seriously been affected by all those daily attacks and stinger attacks and whatever happens. So actually, I think the West could learn a lesson from the Israelis to relax in a certain way, as heavy as it sounds. But yeah, to learn that lesson.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned before, I think we have to learn to live with the threats posed by modernity, and parts of this threat threat system, so to speak, is really the danger of terrorist attacks. It can happen at any time, at any place. There is no guarantee, and whoever from the political field, so to speak, preaches total security will only achieve total surveillance, but not total security. As long as there are individuals who are willing to blow themselves up and get other people killed as well, this will happen. This will happen. There's no way, even if you put a policeman at any corner, at every corner in Boston, in Washington, Berlin, wherever, once you have a person who is willing to blow himself up, there is no total protection, and we need to live with this threat. This is part of our daily risks. It's like using a car or boarding a plane. There always is a certain risk that you might be dead in the end. Yeah, of course, it's only a theoretical fear, but we should be aware of this. And terrorist attacks, they are part of our threat system in the Western world. We have to get used to it. And let us not forget that people in the Middle East, for instance, they live under very difficult, much more difficult circumstances. I mean, let's not forget the Syrians, for instance, they try to survive on a daily basis under much more difficult circumstances. So this should teach us to a certain laissez-faire. Yes. Let's not underestimate the threat. The threat is there. It's a real one. But we should also, lean back to a certain extent.
Well, we have to lean back to a certain extent. We will lean back now because we've come to the end of the show. And indeed, we perhaps have to live with a certain degree of insecurity no matter where we live. I want to thank my guests for sharing their insights and their very much valued opinions. I want to thank you out there for tuning in and looking forward to seeing you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.